Thank you, Madam Speaker, and it is my privilege to rise in the House today and offer my thoughts on Bill S-8, a bill aimed primarily at amending the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act and other acts, including the Emergency Act, to ensure those that Canada has sanctioned and as a result of the war in Ukraine and others cannot claim sanctuary in Canada. I would like to begin by addressing three areas in my remarks this afternoon. I'll start by addressing some of the weaknesses in this legislation, followed by my thoughts that China poses a much stronger and more relevant case for this legislation, and finally why, despite the obvious flaws, I will be supporting this bill, albeit with reservations. When this legislation was brought before the Senate last year, they heard from Dr. Andrea Sharon. Dr. Sharon is the director of the Centre for Defence and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba, and she noted what many of us in this chamber and the other place have noted over the past 7.5 years, and that is that the Liberals really struggled to bring coherent legislation. Whether here or in the Senate, there is a pattern of bringing forward legislation that sounds good, sounds comprehensive, sounds tough, but ultimately achieves nothing. That really is the legislative legacy of these Liberals: symbolism and sanctimony over substance, virtue signaling rather than leading with virtue, legislation that is far more concerned with looking and sounding good rather than doing good, legislation that is ultimately aimed at pleasing certain core constituencies of the Liberal establishment and international entities rather than at achieving real change for Canadians. As Dr. Sharon put it, this bill repeats a pattern whereby Canada tinkers on the margins of legislation without addressing core policy and process issues. As Senator MacDonald noted in his critique, Dr. Sharon's critique of government bills is becoming all too commonplace of late. Many of the bills this government is introducing are increasingly reactive measures, usually quick responses to external events. They are hasty measures designed to be symbolic, and it shows. Despite their claims that they're listening to the experts, a claim experts whose testimony has been systematically blocked or ignored by the Liberals in committee would dispute, their actions are not based on reality. Unless they mean experts in how to keep this government from collapsing under the weight of their own self-righteousness, the weight of their own ineptness. The scandal-plagued government and Prime Minister consistently bring forward legislation when in reality, as noted by expert witnesses at committee, changes to departmental processes and policies would likely be more efficient and ultimately more effective. This virtue signaling reactive approach to legislation is often coupled with creating a straw man. Rather than dealing with the real issue or causes, this government creates a false narrative with false boogeymen and false specters of impending disaster, and then attacks anyone who attempts to take a critical approach to their disingenuous actions. Now, Dr. Sharon asked the Senate committee a simple question. Is this actually a problem that needs to be addressed? Has this actually happened? Are there thousands of pro-war, pro-regime Russians who we sanctioned breaking down the door to get into Canada? Dr. Sharon was unaware of such an occurrence. The Senate heard from Richard St. Marcel, Director General of Immigration and External Review Policy at CBSA. Mr. St. Marcel informed the committee no sanctioned individual from any country is known to have entered Canada in the past 5 years. There have been refusals abroad, 5 under the Special Economic Measures Act, 10 under the Magnitsky Law, but even those refusals are out of 1,858 individuals sanctioned under CEMA and roughly 2,200 individuals listed under various sanction grounds. Put another way, none of these individuals have entered Canada, and fewer than 1% have even attempted to do so. We have a lot of problems with our immigration and border security systems right now, but the simple facts and figures show that this isn't one of them. Nor is it likely to become one of them because despite the Prime Minister's belief that he's created a progressive utopia where everyone wants to live, many people in other parts of the world, including Russia, do not see it that way. Many Russians look at similar so-called progressive policies by the Zelensky government in Ukraine as a degradation of traditional values and by extension as part of their justification for invading in the first place, in order to rescue Ukrainians from what they view as Western decadence and widespread immorality. A vast majority of Russians are appalled by the decline of traditional family values and what they see as the failures and weaknesses of Western culture. A growing number of Russians may be opposed to the war, even to President Putin, but let's not mistake that for a seismic culture shift that will suddenly so embrace progressive policies and values. So the notion that we're going to have a flood of Russians, especially those who have been sanctioned by Canada for supporting the regime and had their assets seized suddenly wanting and trying to come here, is frankly ridiculous. They know they aren't wanted here, and that's fine with them because they don't want to live here. So there's no evidence or even indication that this is currently, or will become a problem. Now, we do have a pressing public safety and immigration problem, and that's with the Chinese Communist government. We have the Chinese ambassador and an untold number of agents in Beijing working to actively undermine our democracy, to intimidate and harm expats and family members, even members of this House, to engage in espionage and cyber attacks. This government has consistently refused to address the actions of Beijing, or better put, actively covered up for China's government. Our national microbiology lab, Chinese police stations that continue to operate despite this government's claim that they don't, and also this government continuing to fund them through the Liberals' Canada Summer Jobs program. In fact, if you substituted China for Russia as the impetus for this legislation, it would be a lot easier to see this as a genuine effort rather than just more virtue signaling. The opposition has been demanding for months for the removal of a Chinese ambassador, for these police stations to be shut down, for the government to stop covering up their friends in Beijing, and to come clean about what happened at the National Microbiology Laboratory and with election interference. Instead, this government seeks to keep Canadians in the dark and distracted by creating a straw man so they won't pay attention to what the actual problem is. I really think this has become the MO for the PMO. Let's address something that hasn't been a problem, that's not a problem, and is unlikely to become a problem, to distract Canadians from the myriad of problems that this government has created. Rather than address the illegal guns they've allowed to flood across the border, as used by violent criminals that they've kept out of jail, they go after law-abiding firearms owners. Rather than go after their wealthy friends, they label small business owners as tax cheats, and they go after them. And now, rather than deal with the pressing and proven problem of Beijing, they raise the unsubstantiated specter of an influx of sanctioned Russians. I'm not denying that Russia presents a threat to our Arctic sovereignty or to our digital infrastructure, or that the invasion of Ukraine is not a problem. It's a big problem. And Canada has gone above and beyond in our efforts to help Ukraine. But this is Canada's parliament, and the issue of those who pose an immediate domestic threat and shouldn't be coming here is not the Russians, it's Beijing. And this is really my main point here today. If we're going to pass this legislation, let's make sure we do so for the right reasons and use it against the right people. Let's use it to finally deal with Beijing, finally deal with comprehensively with the IRGC, those who are already here and pose a direct threat to Canada and to our democracy. With that said, as I noted at the top of my speech, despite these reservations, I will be voting in favor of this legislation. First, it does address a gap in the existing legislation to allow IRCC to deny an individual based on international sanctions. And second, it does grant new powers to the Minister of Public Safety that would allow the Minister to make a determination and issue a removal order. While any additional ministerial power, especially with this government and their track record of shunning accountability at every turn, is a cause for concern, the opposition hopes that by removing the disingenuous excuse of so-called departmental dependence, the Minister will now act in accordance with the will of this House to remove bad actors. Third, Conservatives have always been strong supporters of sanctions and Magnitsky Law, and we have been critical of cases where individuals with ties to certain organizations, but not necessarily on the terrorism list, like members of the IRGC, have been allowed to enter and remain in Canada. The legislation removes the government's chief excuse for failing to deal judiciously with such individuals, so there is a chance it will become useful down the road, especially once a new Conservative government cleans up the legislation. So despite the obvious flaws, there is sufficient merit to this legislation, and I will be supporting it. Thank you, Madam Speaker.